Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh-Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Arabiya studios. These are our top stories. Syria's President Ahmed al-Sharaa is meeting US President Donald Trump at the White House for unprecedented talks. President Trump has threatened to sue the BBC for $1 billion after its chair apologized for how the corporation edited a speech he made. And this year's UN Climate Change Conference COP30 begins in Brazil. Now, Syria's President Ahmed al-Sharaa is meeting US President Donald Trump at the White House for unprecedented talks just days after Washington removed him from the sanctions list. Sharaa, whose opposition forces ousted longtime ruler Bashar al-Assad late last year, will be the first Syrian leader to visit the White House since the country's independence in 1946. For more on this, I'm joined from Washington by former Syrian diplomat and consulate researcher at CGA Center of Global Affairs, Bassam Barabandi. Thank you so much for your time with me this evening, Bassam. A pleasure to have you on the show. First of all, as we just said, this is a historic moment. You met Syria's leader, Ahmed al-Sharaa, yesterday ahead of his meeting with President Donald Trump. How was he feeling about this moment and this meeting he was due to have?
Thank you for having me. Yesterday, Sharaa, and he always like this. He's always ambitious. He always confident. He knows what he wants. He knows how to sell his messages. His idea is very clear. His ambition is very big. I think it will be easy communication with the President Trump since he knows what he wants. He knows and expect what the American wants from Syria as well. So it's a historical moment where this United States is encouraging Syria to move forward in stability, in doing peace with all neighbors, to have civil peace within the old component. And I think Mr. Sharaa understand very well these points, and he will address it accordingly.
Ahmed al-Sharaa fought for al-Qaeda in Iraq and was for a time imprisoned by US forces. His visit comes just 2 days after the US removed him from the sanctions list. Why is Washington doing this now?
Look, we have to put it in a huge or bigger, much bigger perspective. United States is telling the whole radical movements in the world, Sunni or Shiite or whatever, that United States is not anti any group. It's not anti any government or any system. It's about interest. If you work with us to achieve mutual interest, we are open. Mr. Sharaa get that message clearly from day one. He approached United States. He approached the Saudi Arabia, Turkey, all the neighboring country to say the past is past, is done. Now let's build something for the future. Let's build stability. Let's build everything that all the people in the region wants. And I think that his message, it goes exactly with the administration, with the President Trump agenda in the region. And they contain him, they help him. They are open all the doors for him to say, we will give you a chance. Till today, the key word with the American approaching the Syria is we will give you the chance. We will give you all the tools, all the opportunities that this make the chance successful story for you and for the United States. And Mr. Sharaa, he got the message very clearly and wisely. I think he is doing all what United States is expecting him to do toward his people, Syrian people, and toward the interests of the United States. Part of this understanding, this huge package that United States looking at the whole region, they give him all the needs, as I mentioned, so they waive his name from terrorist list in the United States and Security Council. It's become irrelevant. He's the head of the state, transitional head of the states. Today he will sign counter-ISIS. He will join the counter-ISIS coalition. Yesterday, the Syrian forces with American forces, they raid more than 71 places in different parts of Syria. It's a joint operation against ISIS leaders or ISIS sleeping cells. He worked with the United States, with the Western countries to cut the lines between Iran and other terrorist groups in the region, not using Syria. There's no more Captagon the way it used to be. So he's doing everything literally that the Syrian people needs and the American interest matching the American interests and the regional countries. So that's why people are encouraged, the governments are encouraged by his behavior, by his attitude, by his seriousness, and they give him more incentive to go forward. Syria is weak, the situation is weak. Don't forget that we came from 15 years of civil war, 55 years of socialist dictatorship of Assad. Literally, we don't have this institution the way people think it is institution. They are trying to build it. So all this help, all this support to help Syria to be more stable, more engaged with the world, and more happy ending for the whole Syrian and successful story for the American new model.
Bassam, a big question to ask is, in recent months, there has been deadly violence in Syria between Sunni Bedouin tribal fighters and Druze militants. Can the HTS-led government restore stability to Syria? You just mentioned it to me there right now, that Syria is in a difficult position. It's coming out of 15 years of the Bashar al-Assad regime, but we're still seeing violence in the country.
Correct. So number one, just to correct the terms, it's not HTS government. We have 5 or 6 ministers. They have a British nationality, Brazil, American, Canadian, and other nationalities. So they are bringing as much as they can the Syrian experts from outside to be in the government. So it's not HTS or it's not Islamic State government. It's a Syrian government. Yet we cannot say it's a clean, white, colorful government. No, as you mentioned, we have 14 years of the war. There's all kind of militia. All countries are involved in Syrian conflict, as you know. It's not easy to clean everything. But everybody, I think yesterday we had a meeting with Mr. Shara, with the Syrian community in the United States. There was more than 750 people. There was clear harmony in the talks between Shara and the Syrian. There's connection was very warm and very natural. Everybody on the same page. We need to move forward. We have a lot of problems. Foreign Minister Shebani, he was very clear to say we make a mistake in Sweden, in the Druze, and there's a lot of efforts to fix that things. Again, we talk about the institution. We need to build the institution in modern way, in more professional way. I think that will help to solve all domestic issues. The economy is collapsing, as you know, as you can imagine. 90% of Syrians are under poverty line. 60% of Syrian infrastructure has been destroyed. So it's not easy task. And they don't know how to rule all Syria. For them, they will be controlling some part of Syria, Idlib. Now they have to control all Syria with all its complexity. So it takes time, but again, he is sending all the right messages. He's taking all the right steps. People are following and observing the Western countries, the Arab countries, Turkey. Everybody is encouraging, and they say they are serious. And they try to, as much as we can, all together, collectively, Syrian and the Western country or the neighbor countries, to move forward, to solve these issues. Is it easy? It's not easy, absolutely not easy. Mistrust is big, the resources is very limited, sanction is heavy. The importance of today's visit. So today's visit, they will announce 3 or 4 announcements from Commerce Department, U.S. Commerce Department, U.S. Treasury, State Department, in the sign that we, United States, encourage direct investment money into Syria, just to help the economy and help the government to stand up in a professional way to solve all these issues that inside Syria.
We've just spoken and you've just talked to me about the complexities inside of Syria and how difficult it is coming out of the regime that the Syrians were under to now rebuilding, to development. They're holding the talks with Donald Trump at the moment. Due shortly in the White House is al-Shara. And according to reports, the US is planning to establish a military base near Damascus and also a possible security pact between Syria and Israel. You spoke to al-Shara yesterday yourself, the leader of Syria. What did he say could be achieved in today's meeting, and what is important for him right now?
He was very clear that Syria is Syria. It's 185,000 square meters, and and all is Syria. So that means he will not give concessions on the land for anyone. That very clear red lines for him. He wants peace with Israel. Since he became president till today, he never mentioned any word hostile to Israel. He just said we want peace in the region. They engage with peace talks with Israeli. I think 5 or 6 rounds of talks, many different parts of the world. I think it was very close to achieve some demilitarization connection between Syria and Israel, to bring it to where the border was, or the contact forces between Syria and Israel in 1974 used to be. I think we were very close. I think still we are very close. It's more about United States to put more pressure on Israeli to accommodate the security for both sides. I think we back to the Syrian people more than the Shara. I think most of the Syrian people, they see the value of have peace with Israel, to have stability in the region. We are really tired from the world. We have in Europe, we have more than 6 million Syrian refugees in Europe. I think most of them, they would love to come back to Syria. To come back to Syria, they need school, for example. Basic thing, they need school, they need electricity. How you encourage person in Germany or United Kingdom or France, let's say, or even in Turkey to come back with his family to Syria, and there's no school system or no healthcare system. So the people are aware that stability is important. Stability include have kind of arrangement with Israel. So it's with a public mood momentum. It's up now to the United States to put real pressure on Israel to accept whatever deal they have done, they have achieved. I don't think, I think tomorrow will be much better than today. Again, the US understand the value of this moment. They understand that this person can deliver internally into Syria and in the United States interest and the regional interest. That's why they are supporting him. That's why Mr. Trump is meeting with him. Definitely, there's a lot of conditions. It's not easy meeting will be. I think the American will be very clearly about the investment, about protecting minorities, about institution, about the peace with Israel as well, about countering Iran, countering ISIS, Captain. There's a lot of challenges and demands that Americans understand very well, the challenges that the new government face. So they are trying to match what they need of what available with this. So that meeting today, I think, will try to narrow the gaps, to fill more U.S. support for the Syrian government to achieve its domestic agenda that would reflect positively on the regional agenda.
Bassam Barabandi, thank you so much for speaking to me and your insights on that historic visit. We can now go to Ambassador James Franklin Jeffrey, a former US envoy to Syria. James, a pleasure to have you on the show. You were the US envoy to Syria under President Trump during his first term. What do you make of him meeting the Syrian leader Ahmed al-Sharaa today in the White House?
Thanks for having me on. It is simply the culmination of a policy under the first Trump administration to support Hayat Tahrir al-Sham indirectly, because they were still on the terrorist list, in two things. One is their fight against Assad, Iran and its proxies, and Russia in Idlib in the northwest. Secondly, al-Sharaa and his people were providing refuge to 3 million internally displaced Syrians right on the Turkish border. We were terrified they would flee into Turkey and on into Europe, creating a repeat of the chaos in Europe and Turkey in 2015. So we provided economic support through USAID. We had everybody up to President Trump demanding of the Russians not to launch attacks into Idlib. And in various ways, indirectly, we supported him. And in fact, in the end, he delivered, along with the rest of the Syrian people, to overthrow the hated, dangerous Assad regime. We now have the chance, with Iran defeated throughout the region, finally, and most importantly in Syria, to start building a new Middle East. That's what this visit is all about. It's important for Syria and the Syrian people, but it's very important for the region and for the American vision of how the region should evolve.
And since taking power, Sharaa has been working hard to re-establish Syria's presence on the world stage after decades of isolation and 13 years of deadly civil war. But does the US president and Donald Trump hold the key to Syria's future?
Americans think they hold the key to everything. That's not true. But what is very important and what will be discussed today is the Caesar sanctions. During my tenure, we put them in place to crush the Assad economy and put him under the sort of pressure that would lead to a ceasefire, which we did get, and then eventually his overthrow. But now the Caesar sanctions need to be lifted. They are stifling in foreign investment. They are stifling even the transfer of money because they're very powerful, very intricate sanctions. The U.S. Congress has to lift them. They are reviewing alternatives. Some of them will not do the job because they will be temporary or they will be not complete. And it's up to President Trump to pick up the phone and tell those remaining members of Congress that they need to support this, or otherwise the Syrian recovery will lag and the entire vision for the region will be put at risk.
And President Trump met Gerrans in May during a visit to Riyadh, where he described him as a tough guy with a very strong past. In the recent months, we've seen deadly violence in Syria between religious minorities. How concerning is this?
All violence, every death is of concern. But those of us who have been in the region, and I spent 10 years in conflict zones, Kuwait, the Kurdish areas of eastern Turkey, Iraq, and of course, Syria, there's always a certain amount of violence. The question is, what is the government doing about it? How widespread is it? Is it increasing? Is it decreasing? We saw 2 outbreaks in the spring and early summer in the west against Alawites and in the south against Druze. But we haven't seen anything since then, and the al-Shara government has moved to investigate these things, to at least arrest a few people. It's not enough, but it certainly is a refreshing change from what we saw under Assad and, frankly, what I've seen in many other countries. So I think at this point, President Trump, but more importantly, the international community that is united in trying to help this guy at this point, will give him the benefit of the doubt, and we should.
And I just want to get a final thought for you on a slightly different story. The chair of the BBC has apologised for an error of judgment over the edit of President Trump's speech. The Director General and the CEO have both resigned over this controversy. Trump is now threatening to sue the BBC for $1 billion. In your opinion, do you think the BBC has lost all credibility, and will Donald Trump win this fight?
I don't know about a legal matter involving Trump. That is a real snake pit to go into. But I will say that the BBC acted correctly in removing its top leadership. This is a very serious issue. It was blatant. It involved one of the most important and powerful people to the governors of BBC, the British government, that is Donald Trump. And it underscores the problem. It's easy to report objectively and fairly on people and things you like. It's very difficult to report, in this case, Donald Trump, on people and things you don't like. But that's where the credibility of any news media outlet is measured.
Ambassador James Franklin Jeffrey, brilliant to speak to you and get your thoughts on that. Thank you so much for your time this evening. Now, the BBC has issued an apology and said it made an error of judgment over how it edited a speech by President Trump in a Panorama documentary that made it look like he was urging people to attack the US Capitol. It follows the resignation of the CEO of the BBC News, Deborah Turness, and its Director General, Tim Davie, last night. They both admitted mistakes had been made. Meanwhile, President Trump has sent a letter to the BBC threatening to sue the organisation for $1 billion. We can now speak to the deputy editor of The Spectator, Freddy Gray. Freddy, great to have you on the show. President Trump is threatening to sue the BBC for $1 billion if it does not respond within days over speech edit error. Trump is going big. He has sued other newspapers and media outlets. What do you make of all of this?
Well, he is going big, but what's interesting is that $1 billion is fairly small if you compare it to his other lawsuits against media companies. I think his one with the New York Times is 15 billion. He's got one against the Wall Street Journal for 10 billion. It's very much in the character of the second Trump administration to do this. They go after people who are in their way. They go after them very, very hard. And what's interesting with the BBC story is that he has sort of tapped into a kind of mini civil war within the BBC, which is, as a lot of your viewers will know, is a very big and important institution in British life. And it's had this report, this Prescott report, leaked memo last week to the Daily Telegraph, detailing instances of bias within the BBC, within its news reporting, and the Trump speech, the example of them horrifically editing the Trump speech to make it sound much worse than it was, that's been the leading item. But what's really going on is a kind of big knife fight within the BBC over who controls the BBC. And you're hearing a lot of complaints this morning from people on the sort of liberal left of the BBC that there is a kind of right-wing coup going on. This word coup seems to be being used a lot. And that's because various figures who are appointed by Boris Johnson, who are now involved in the BBC, were behind the report into its biases. So there's a tremendous fight going on. Add Donald Trump, and you've got amazing pyrotechnics.
Yeah, absolutely. Pyrotechnics for sure. Freddie, what you've just described to me there is a corporation in absolute chaos. The BBC is now searching for a new boss and CEO after scandal after scandal. Why has the Director General, Tim Davie, and the CEO resigned now? This is not the first problem that they faced. It feels like it's been months, almost years of it. We've not really seen much apology or much response taken. It just seems to be like, why now? Why was this the straw that broke the camel's back?
Well, I think it was a combination of things. I think there's been a large build-up of pressure on Tim Davie. There's been a lot of mistakes. There was a Glastonbury concert this summer where Bob Vylan shouted death, death to the IDF, and the BBC didn't cut it, and they let it broadcast for a bit longer after that, which was a big sort of breach of its impartiality. There was a Hugh Edwards scandal, who was a disgraced BBC presenter who had sexual problems that were reported in the press, and seemed like the BBC had been covering it up for some time. There are endless examples of BBC problems, and you can put it down to a few bad eggs, or you can say there's something wrong with the direction of the broadcaster. And I think finally Davie got the message, so did Deborah Turness, that they couldn't go on. But I think what is interesting is that these scandals have happened a lot to the BBC over the last 20 years. And they've gone through quite a few director generals, quite a few resignations of senior staff after there's been some scandal. But the real problem, I think, and a lot of people are realizing this, is that maybe the BBC just has to accept that in an age of streaming and, global multimedia, the BBC's license fee purpose, that means that British people like myself have to pay a license fee just to be able to watch the BBC. It's a tax effectively on people who watch television, linear television. In an age of non-linear television, or increasingly diversified television and entertainment, the purpose of the BBC, the purpose of the license fee is not really clear, and it's not really sustainable, a lot of people think. So there is going to be a push now, and this will be decried in left of centre circles as a kind of sinister Tory plot to privatise the BBC, etc., etc. But there will be a push now to say, well, why don't we have a BBC funding model that works just like Netflix or any other media group, where you pay a monthly subscription voluntarily rather than this current license fee arrangement, which leaves a lot of people very unhappy.
Yeah, absolutely, Freddie. That's a really good point, that there's still a license fee that needs to be paid, but it's publicly funded, the BBC in the UK. But just looming large over this whole story is President Donald Trump. And we've seen him call out fake news and say the media is trying to stitch him up. Now we've seen this unfold at the BBC. I think the big question is, you mentioned the future of the licence fee, but what is the future of the BBC? Do you think we could see the it change into a Netflix model? Do you think there's going to be a big shake-up now that we've seen Tim Davie leave?
I suspect that there'll be a tremendous fuss about it. There'll be a campaign to get rid of the license fee, but it will be ignored, shoved under the carpet. The BBC will appoint someone else. We don't know who. And then in about 6 months to another year, there'll be another disgrace and scandal, and it will just carry on rumbling on. My hunch is that this is not going to be enough to kind of dismantle the BBC as it currently is. It's a very powerful institution in Britain. And as for Donald Trump, I do think an interesting part of this story is that Donald Trump and a lot of people in his administration anyway are very concerned about speech in Britain. And the BBC ties into this somewhat. They feel that there is a sort of climate of censorship in Britain, a climate of fake news and censorship that they really dislike. And another interesting story that's breaking today, again, the Telegraph with another scoop, is that Imran Ahmed, who works for the Centre for Countering Digital Hate in America, and that's a British institution which is about online hatred, combating online hatred, has been threatened with deportation from America. And the reason that's interesting is because Morgan McSweeney, who is effectively runs the government in many ways, a very important figure within the Labour government here, is behind the Centre for Countering Digital Hate. And it's felt that the Centre for Countering Digital Hate, while it claims to counter digital hate, actually propagates quite a lot of misinformation and disinformation about what's going on in the world. So it'll be very interesting to see how much the Trump administration starts to focus its energies on its concerns about disinformation, fake news on the BBC, and then the BBC will inevitably at some stage return fire, or British journalists will return fire by talking about fake news and disinformation in Trump world. It's going to be a bit of an ongoing fight, I think.
Yes, indeed. And Freddy, we also saw the press secretary, Caroline Levitt, talking about this on her social media and telling people, encouraging them to watch GB News. So I'm sure the story still has legs. Freddy Gray, deputy editor of The Spectator. Thank you. Let's take a look at some of the other stories making the headlines today. After 40 days of gridlock, the US Senate has passed a deal aimed at ending the longest government shutdown in history. The bipartisan agreement marks the first major step towards reopening federal services, but the measure still faces hurdles in the House of Representatives before 1.4 million unpaid federal workers can return to their jobs. Typhoon Wong has left the Philippines after causing floods and landslides that killed at least 4 people, including 2 children. The storm cut power across the region and struck the area with winds of up to 185 kilometers an hour. Over 1.4 million people were evacuated before it made landfall, following last week's deadly typhoon Kalmagi. Former French President Nicolas Sarkozy has been released from prison after 20 days behind bars over a conviction in the Libyan funding case. A judge granted his release pending an appeal. Sarkozy called his time in jail grueling, and the appeal hearing is scheduled for March. Now, South Korea's former president Yoon Suk-yeol is facing further criminal charges over his short-lived martial law attempt last year. Today, special prosecutors pushed fresh charges that Yoon intentionally tried to provoke North Korea and create a crisis to justify his military takeover attempt. Chris Gilbert reports.
Yoon Suk-yeol's failed martial law attempt only lasted about 6 hours, but the fallout and the consequences continue. On Monday, prosecutors were pushing fresh charges against Yoon Suk-yeol that he went against South Korea's state interests and intentionally tried to benefit a state enemy, as well as other abuses of power.
무인기 평양 침투 등의 방법으로
We indicted former President Yoon Suk-yeol, former Defense Minister Kim Yong-hyun in our investigation into allegations he attempted to induce a North Korean attack and provoke military conflict between South and North Korea in order to declare martial law, by means such as using drones or infiltrating Pyongyang.
윤석열 전 대통령
Late on the evening of December 3, Yoon declared martial law, citing a national security crisis, but Parliament had it shut down by the next morning. Prosecutors say Yoon had in fact conspired to create conditions that would have allowed the declaration of the emergency martial law. Prosecutors are arguing their evidence support claims that Yoon intentionally wanted the military to target places that might have embarrassed North Korea into responding. Yoon Suk-yeol has consistently said he never intended to impose military rule, but declared martial law to sound the alarm about wrongdoing by opposition parties and to protect South Korea from, quote, anti-state elements. Separately, Yoon Suk-yeol's wife, Kim Kyun-hee, has also appeared in court recently to stand trial for corruption and other charges, including her alleged involvement in a stock manipulation scheme and the meddling of candidate nominations for elections. The couple have been held in separate detention facilities, but if Yoon Suk-yeol is found guilty, he could face the death penalty. Chris Gilbert, Arabiya English.
Now, this year's UN Climate Change Conference, COP30, has got underway in Brazil today. However, leaders of the United States and China and India, the world's three biggest polluters, won't attend the summit. Meanwhile, the European Union has promised to stay engaged. We can now go to our correspondent, William Denslow, who is in Brussels for us this evening. William, great to have you on the show. So what are the big items on the agenda at this year's COP?
Well, a huge issue on the agenda is these pledges that nations were obliged to provide to the United Nations, really pointing out how they plan to cut emissions by the year 2035. This is part of a consistent 5-year roadmap that all nations must adhere to after the Paris Climate Agreement all those years ago. You mentioned the leadership role of the European Union, seen as absolutely crucial, considering the fact that those major polluters like the United States, China, India will not be present in Brazil. Now, looking at the EU and what they're bringing to the table, it took last-minute wranglings and discussions here in Brussels, but eventually member states came up to an agreement that by 2035 the plan for the EU is to cut emissions by a range of between 66.25% to 72.5% of emissions compared to 1990 levels by the year 2035. That, in comparison, looking at the likes of China, who have pledged to cut emissions by 7% to 10%, far shy of the 30% that the EU had been pushing for. The EU says that this shows a huge amount of ambition, that they are leaders, but there are major question marks about potential loopholes included in the EU's targets, and that is something that will certainly be seen by analysts as a potential vehicle to undermine the EU's green credentials at this year's COP.
And the UN is warning that millions of people risk being displaced because of climate change. William, can you tell us a little bit more about these concerns?
Absolutely. These are stark warnings from the UN's refugee agency, UNHCR, warning that they predict that 250 million people have been displaced due to climate-related disasters over the past decade. That amounts, according to their estimates, to around 67,000 people each and every day. They also have strong warnings for the future, what will continue unless the worst effects of climate change are not addressed. They warn, according to this new UN report, that nations impacted by severe climate-related hazards will go from just 3 nations at the moment to 65 countries by the year 2040. So some stark warnings there from the UN, really adding to this sense of urgency around this year's COP30.
And you know, William, there's been so many questions being asked about this COP30, and basically how significant is it that there is no high-level US delegation attending at all? And lots of questions have been raised about the relevance of COP.
Absolutely. For the global community and many climate activists, it is seen as a major blow, considering the heft that the United States brings, and not just as a major polluting nation, but of course the role that the United States historically plays on the geopolitical stage. Now, many are speculating what this means for the likes of the European Union. Plenty of analysts have been talking about this role that the US and the EU have played in the past, especially on the issue of climate change, the so-called good cop, bad cop. The EU generally playing the role as the good cop, the US more of the enforcer. So without Washington's presence, a real question is that what can the European Union do to cajole other nations to play their part to continue to hit ambitious climate targets? The EU says it is leading by example with the fact that they've just announced plans to cut emissions by 90% come 2040. But the real question is, does the EU have the same heft, the same political weight without the United States in their corner supporting them? Major questions such as what will developing countries do when it comes to burden sharing, economic burden sharing, as part of their clean transition without the financial support of the likes of the United States. So this is seen as a huge blow for COP. But the message from European Union leaders at the meeting in Brazil, they say they're doubling down on their leadership efforts.
And William, you just mentioned to me there that the EU agreed last-minute action plan to slash emissions by 2040. But the big question is, how is that agreement being greeted by environmental groups?
Well, some environmental groups say that the EU has essentially chosen loopholes over leadership. And this is because of some of the carve-outs, some of the caveats that had to be found to reach consensus among the 27 member states. There were huge divisions over recent months trying to find this agreement, with the likes of Italy, Poland wanting more safeguards when it came to competitiveness, economic policy, to not come at the detriment of this green agenda. The other nations on the other side of the debate, the likes of Spain, pushing for more green credentials from the EU going forward. Therefore, when this agreement was reached, there are some key carve-out, some key issues that need to be discussed, such as the fact that this 90% figure to reduce emissions, 5% of that can come from carbon credits from overseas, with a potential of an extra 5% in the future. There is also reportedly some kind of escape clause, essentially meaning that if forests here in the European Union fail to absorb the amount of CO2 that many experts predict they will, then there will be an emergency valve that will see these climate policies tweaked and altered going forward. Environmental groups say that is a failure and just shows there are too many carve-outs for the EU to get serious about what is needed to sufficiently address the impacts of climate change.
William Denslow in Brussels, thank you so much for joining us. Let's take a look at the top business news now. Gold prices rose by 2% on Monday, hitting their highest level in 2 weeks. The upward trend is attributed to growing expectations that the US Federal Reserve may cut interest rates next month. Last month, Morgan Stanley predicted that gold prices could climb to over $4,000 per troy ounce by mid-2026. China has lifted export controls on computer chips used in car production. Exemptions have been granted to exports made by the Chinese-owned company. Xperia for civilian use. In a bid to ease trade tensions, the US and China has suspended port fees for American ships and paused an export ban on certain metals used in the semiconductor industry. A reminder of our top stories. Syria's President Ahmed al-Shara has begun a meeting with US President Donald Trump at the White House for unprecedented talks. President Trump has threatened to sue the BBC for $1 billion after its chair apologized for how the corporation edited a speech he did make. And this year's UN Climate Change Conference, COP30, begins in Brazil. And that's all from us on W News. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on X. Plus, we'll be back in a couple of hours with W News Extra. Goodbye and thank you.